Chapter 25. Your request to have Sophia Russo, minor, age 8, removed from your official family history has been granted. The state will pay the costs of her care and education until she reaches her majority. You are no longer considered bound to her or responsible for her in any way. Final decision of the Council Subcommittee on Genetic Inheritance, November 2060. Max's embrace tightened until it almost hurt. But she needed it, craved it. The lost, indelibly fractured half of her clung to him, realizing it was being accepted, no matter the extent of its flaws. The anchor thing, he said. That's what saved you. Because it's a rare ability. She nodded. When the monster threw me through the window, he didn't just scar my face. He also broke my mind. She'd been a terrified child who'd finally realized that no help would come, that she'd soon be buried in an unmarked grave beside Carrie and Byler. But my brain didn't give up. It rerouted itself directly into the fabric of the net, the only thing big enough to hold together what remained of my psyche. I am so damn proud of you, he said, his voice low and husky. She wanted to grab onto the commitment, the promise implicit in his words. I'm really broken, Max. It was the final secret, the final truth. I can pretend to be normal, but I'm not. I never will be. You survived. How you've done it doesn't matter. The fact that you have? It's better revenge on that bastard, and the ones that allowed him to do what he did than anything else. Shuddering at the unflinching acceptance in his tone, she moved one hand lightly over his back. His muscles shifted beneath her touch, as if in response. Growing bolder, she pressed harder, felt his abdomen grow taut against her. It was instinct to spread out her hand, run her fingernails over the fabric in sensual exploration. Swearing low under his breath, Max moved back a step, gripping her arms at the elbows. Aren't you going too fast? No, she could feel her nerves, ragged and frayed, close to overload, but still she wanted more, wanted to fill herself to the brim with him, until she had enough for a lifetime. Don't stop, Max. The touch keeps me here. Not in the past. Max groaned. Drink. And behave. He put the hot chocolate in her hands and picking up his coffee, headed to the couch. Left with no choice, she followed a second later. Putting her drink beside his on the coffee table, she turned her body sideways on the couch, terrified she'd scared him with the voracious depth of her need, but not ready to accept his decree. He'd told her she'd never have to beg. He'd accepted her. He was hers. I'm not misbehave. Max had his mouth on Sophia's before he could think about the consequences, his hand tangled in her hair. God, he was so angry over what had been done to her, so fucking pissed at the parents who'd rejected her when they should have stood by her. And because he'd die before he hurt her, his anger had nowhere to go, except into a raging protectiveness. Running his tongue along the seam of her lips, he urged her to part for him. And when she did, he swept in without hesitation, taking, tasting, claiming. Her hands fell to rest on his thigh, excruciatingly close to his cock. Releasing his grip on her, he picked up those delicate gloved hands and put them on his shoulders. She clenched her fingers on him, her nails biting just enough through the thin gloves and the material of his t-shirt to make him want to strip it all off and tell her to use those nails on his flesh. Hell. Breaking the kiss, he put his hands on her waist. Straddle me. She was all huge eyes and kiss-bruised mouth, but she did as he asked, her curvy body coming down on his thighs even as she leaned in and took his mouth. He hadn't expected that, hadn't expected her to seize the reins. But he was more than willing to let her have her way. Her kiss was inexperienced, hesitant and so arousing, he had to lock his muscles to keep from pushing up that primly buttoned cardigan and cupping a sweet, plump breast in his palm even as he took her mouth in a much more sexual fashion. Instead he let her sip at him, let her stroke and taste and lick. The last made his fingers clench on her hips. She did it again. Sophia Russo was a quick study. Feeling his lips curve in a smile that was more than a little feral, he sucked at her upper lip, bit down on the lower. She jerked, then pressed into him, her arms weaving around his neck. Taking that as a yes, he repeated the caress, moving his hands down her hips and over the taut length of her thighs at the same time. A shuddering moan before she finally tore away her mouth. Her eyes were awash in black, a sea of purest midnight. He'd been ready for that. But he wasn't ready for the fever in her cheeks, the thumping beat of the pulse in her neck, the way her body turned all loose and limber, as if she was drunk. Alarm spiked. Sophie, talk to me. Dropping her head to his shoulder, she rubbed her cheek against his t-shirt, a lazy kitten. I think you blew my circuits. The dazed comment made him want to laugh in spite of the savagery of his emotions, but worry cut the impulse mid-thought. Maybe this was as close as they'd ever come. Him and his Sophie. Are you in pain? Another lazy rub against him, her hand clenching and unclenching on his other shoulder. I never realized men and women were so different. Not really. Her breath blew hot on the skin of his neck as she spoke, her body a warm luscious weight against his aroused form. It's quite extraordinary. Baby, you can't avoid the question. Brushing her hair very carefully off her face, he looked down to find her eyes closed. Are you in pain? Have you ever had your foot fall asleep after a period of inactivity? Yes. And the sharp stabs afterward when you try to use it? A smile flirted with her lips. That's what it feels like. Her eyes opened. I'm waking up, Max. A little pain won't make me take a step backward. Protectiveness and pride smashed up against each other. No more tonight. No, Max. She moved slightly across his body, an erotic stroke and a stubborn will. No, please. He let her kiss him again, let her convince him. But when her skin flushed fever hot, when her muscles began to quiver, he broke the contact, lifting her off his body and onto the couch. No matter how much he wanted to claim her in every way a man could claim a woman, he wouldn't do it if it would destroy her. No more, Sophie. You can't process everything at once. But... He placed a finger against her lips. That foot that falls asleep? It doesn't wake up all at once. She stared at him for long moments, but he got a nod at last, leaving her to repair her shields as much as she could, and it was a fucking fist in his heart that their touching hurt her on any level. He got up, splashed ice water on his face, then returned with the case files. Ready? Yes. Taking a sip of the hot chocolate he'd made her, she met his gaze, those eerie eyes of endless black, impenetrable, unreadable. Max. Yes. Will you remember me? His heart broke into 1,000 pieces. Always. Early the next morning found Sasha sitting across from Nikita in a conference room at Dark River's business HQ. I didn't think you'd come. Nikita's response was pragmatic. Dark River is an important business partner. This isn't a business meeting, Sasha said, refusing to let her mother ignore the truth. I thought I made that clear in my request. I'm sorry if you were misled. Nikita remained an ice sculpture on the other side of the table. Every contact with you is business. If you weren't part of Dark River, there'd be no need for contact at all. Hurt, yeah, it hurt. But Sasha was stronger now, and she had the strength of the pack behind her. She could feel their wild protectiveness on the other side of the door that enclosed her in this room with Nikita. But most of all, she could feel the love of her panther. I wanted to tell you. You're pregnant, Nikita said without ceremony. It's difficult to miss. But so many people had, Sasha thought, trying not to read in Nikita's keen eyes any kind of an emotional meaning. I'm about 5 months along. You must be able to feel the fetus move. Sasha curled her hand into a fist under the table, trying to keep her emotions in check. Yes, the baby is rather feisty, especially at 3 a.m. A pause. You were the same. And there in that instant Sasha knew she didn't understand her mother as well as she thought she did. That counselor Nikita Duncan had secrets even an empath couldn't plumb. Nikita spoke again before Sasha could. I've heard rumors that the leopards isolate their pregnant mates during the final months of their pregnancies. Sasha rolled her eyes. The tabloids made that up after one of the women in the pack was prescribed bed rest because of complications. You must know how they sensationalize everything. Her panther, overprotective as he was, would never try to keep her apart from those she considered hers, both in the pack and outside of it. But that wasn't what she'd asked her mother here to discuss. Why did you send me the book by Alice Eldridge? You're a cardinal with the strength to control tens of thousands, Nikita answered, picking up her organizer. Having an individual of your strength in my corner would be an asset. The benefit would outweigh any cost associated with your flaw. Once that would have cut Sasha to the quick. Now she wondered just how many lies Nikita had told her over her lifetime. Sophia woke from the most sleepless of nights, her body aching from the inside out, her skin too tight, her nerves shredded. Everything was off. Irritation burned inside her, and it had no target, no focus. Showering helped calm her body a fraction, and so did an intense 10-minute meditation. Feeling slightly more in control, she dressed in a black pantsuit paired with a white shirt, dried then plaited her hair. Bearing a violence-touched face, Max didn't seem to find the least objectionable, and forced herself to eat a nutrition bar for breakfast. Her cop, she thought, would not approve, strange twisting sensations in her abdomen, the renewed prickling of her skin. Heat was just starting to spot her cheeks when the doorbell rang. Throwing the wrapper of the nutrition bar in the recycler, she walked over and opened the door. It was his scent that hit her first. Exotic and familiar, male in a way she couldn't explain. but she knew she'd be able to distinguish it from a million others. Max. His eyes narrowed as he entered, closing the door behind himself. You're flushed. What's wrong? She rubbed gloved hands over her arms. I don't know. I feel edgy. My skin, my body. The worry disappeared from his face, to be replaced by something darker and full of a quiet masculine amusement. It's called frustration, sweetheart. Frustration. Synonymous with aggravation, irritation, dissatisfaction. Yes, she thought. That's the word. I'd have more sympathy for you except that I spent the night with a permanent hard-on. Her eyes dropped to his groin. He groaned even as his body reacted rather spectacularly. Sophia wanted to touch. Fix it, she ordered. You know how to end my frustration and yours, and I'm no longer as overwrought as I was last night. He blew out a breath. Yeah? Maybe I do. And maybe so do you. There was something exquisitely sensual in his words. She never got to hear what he would have said because his cell phone beeped at that moment, and everything changed. It's Bart. All hint of sensuality leaving his expression, Max put the phone to his ear. His response is not telling Sophia much. I'll talk to her. He snapped the phone shut. Bonner's broken sooner than we thought. He's angry, Sophia said, feeling a layer of ice form around her, an impenetrable barrier threaded with dark tendrils that tasted of the net. His ego can't take that I ended yesterday's conference before he was ready. Turning, she headed to her bedroom. Max caught her arm, felt her tremble though he'd been careful not to touch skin. What are you doing? Packing an overnight case, she said, her voice firm, though her body swayed toward his before she caught herself. He'll talk this time, I'm sure of it. She nodded at his cell phone. Call Nikita. We can't leave mid-case, Max said, because though those lost girls owned a piece of his heart, they were already gone, their lights doused. But Sophia, she was alive, her flame flickering against the violent storm of Bonner's evil. He couldn't believe that Carissa White and her sisters in death would want him to sacrifice Sophia to bring them home. Nikita will allow us to take a short break, Sophia replied. As you said yourself, this killer is unlikely to strike in the near future. She kept talking, though he could see the jagged rise and fall of her chest, the glittering pain in her eyes. The forensic data from Edward Chan's murder scene will have been more thoroughly processed by the time we return, and we've already spoken to the witnesses. We can continue to run deep background checks and verify their alibis for the earlier murders from a distance. Max waited until she paused for breath. You have to turn this over to another J. No. This is mine. Tiny lines fanned out from the corners of her lush mouth, an indication of stubbornness, one he just learned to read. I'll do this. I'll finish this. Max didn't budge. He had a whole streak of stubborn in him too. You've told me how close you are to losing your telepathic shields. Working with a mind like Bonner's will only put more stress. He froze as she pressed a finger to his lips. They're lost, Max. A bleakness in her eyes it hurt him to witness. I have to find them, bring them home from those unmarked graves. He heard in those words an echo of the nightmare summer that had almost destroyed her, a silent, painful ache, and knew he had to let her do this. Even a hint of a problem and you get out. Agreed. It was more an order than a question, but she nodded. Agreed. I'm letting Bart know he needs to have an MPSI on standby. That's a good precaution. No MPSI could heal the telepathic deterioration of a J, much less of an already damaged one like Sophia, but they could perhaps help her handle any physical symptoms. However, make sure the M remains outside the interrogation room. Bonner will pounce on even a hint of weakness. Don't let the bastard get to you. Tugging down her glove to expose a patch of naked skin between glove and cuff, he bent his head as she watched in thrall. His kiss branded her from the inside out. We have the little matter of frustration to discuss. Chapter 26. Sometimes evil wins. But not here. Not today. From the private case notes of Detective Max Shannon. State of New York v. Bonner. Nikita wasn't pleased at the interruption in her investigation, but she didn't attempt to stand in their way after Max made it clear that not only would they continue to work her case while in Wyoming, but that Bonner's victims had a prior claim on his loyalty. How long will this trip take? She asked. If Bonner gives up the bodies, a grim hope, I'll have to inform the parents. They knew him, trusted him, would know why he'd come after so long. After that, forensics will take over. Since Bonner is already in prison for the length of his natural life, it's not imperative I be there at every moment. Though before he would have wanted to see it through to the bitter, destructive end. Now he had other priorities. I can delegate the supervision to one of the other detectives. Good cops, cops who'd sacrificed weekends, given up vacations, to help Max in the hunt for the butcher of Park Avenue, and keep an eye on things from a distance. Of course, he'd never be free of the Bonner case, not truly. And perhaps he didn't want to be. A man carried scars on his heart. They made him who he was. Sophie would leave the biggest scar of all. No. He refused to lose her. This Jay with her hunger for touch and her gifted mind. Very well, detective. Picking up a cell phone call, she turned to the plate glass window. I expect you to keep me informed. Max found himself momentarily caught by the image of Nikita standing silhouetted against the glass, her gaze somewhere far in the distance. Powerful. Lethal. Alone. Sasha stretched out her legs on the ottoman in Tammy's living room and leaned back against the softness of the couch. Like everyone else in Dark River, she'd headed to their healer the instant she'd needed comfort of a feminine kind. Lucas had dropped her off after lunch with a kiss, though she knew it was only because Tammy's mate, Nathan, was home. Likely, there was another sentinel prowling around outside anyway. Dark River took the protection of its healer dead seriously. Suspicious scrabbles sounded from behind her. Feeling her lips tug upward, she remained in place, her eyes closed. Little click-clacks on the wooden floor, silenced as they hit the rugs. Then a few whispering scratches and she felt a warm, playful presence walk along the top of the sofa back to lie down a few inches from her ear. Another presence just as playful, a little more mischievous, settled beside her thigh as she'd half expected a baby roar to make her jump up in surprise. But when she opened her eyes, Julian and Roman, Tammy's twins, both in leopard form, were looking at her with expressions so innocent, her heart melted. How am I supposed to resist? She murmured, stroking Jules while she glanced up at Rome. Getting up, he patted over to nuzzle at her ear. She tried to catch him in one arm to bring him down, but he jumped onto the couch beside her so she could pet him too. Are my little demons bothering you? Tammy asked, walking into the living room with a tray piled high with Sasha's favorite chocolate chip cookies hot from the oven. They're being sweethearts, Sasha said, as Rome settled down with his paws on her thigh, his eyes closing in bliss as she petted his gorgeous little head with firm, sure strokes. They're not as rambunctious with me anymore. What do you expect? Tammy rolled her eyes. They're growing up around Nate and the others. They figured out you're to be looked after. Sasha laughed as Tammy took a seat opposite her. Ferocious, the twins' pet kitten, immediately made himself at home in the healer's lap. Shouldn't they both be in kindergarten? They're doing half days at the moment. Just got home a few minutes back, Tamsin said with a fond smile. They both got a good behavior report from the teacher. Kissing the pad of her index finger, Sasha touched it to the tip of Julian's nose. Lifting a paw, he nipped playfully at her finger. Why do you sound so surprised? Tell me you're not. Sasha couldn't help it, she laughed again, even as Jules and Rome both gave little growls. They'll grow up into wonderful young men, you know. Tammy's eyes softened. I know. Petting a purring Ferocious, she leaned back in her seat. So you saw your mother today? Yes. Roman butted against her hand when she stopped stroking him, and she continued at once, scratching him behind the ears in that way he liked before moving up and down through the beautiful gold and black fur of his back. I don't know if I'm fooling myself, but I think there's something different about her. Tamsin didn't say anything, just let Sasha talk. And she did. She talked about her hopes, her worries, her fears. Do you think, she said at last, it's just the emotions of pregnancy? I mean, I love our baby so much. I can't imagine any mother not feeling this way. Under her now unmoving hands, Jules and Rome lay curled up, fast asleep, two exquisitely precious lives. Sire different, Tammy said at last. You know that far better than I ever could. But you're also an empath. And if your heart tells you there's some hope of a healthy relationship with Nikita. I don't know, Sasha said. I just know I'm not ready to give up on her yet. Tammy's smile was slow, strong as her healer's heart. Then I guess Counselor Nikita Duncan had better watch out. Having dropped a dubious-looking Morpheus off at Dark River HQ, to be taken home by Clay, Max and Sophia arrived at the closest airport to the D2 penitentiary less than 3 hours after Max's meeting with Nikita. A 20-minute drive later, and they were at the facility. Bonner still refusing to talk? Max asked Bart after Sophia returned to the room, having undergone a quick preliminary checkup at the M-size hands. Max met her gaze, caught the very slight shake of her head. Relief twisted around his heart, she was hanging on, refusing to surrender to the death that had been stalking her whole life. Bastard hasn't said a word since he asked for Ms. Russo, Bart said, glancing at Sophia. Be careful, Ms. Russo. I have a feeling he's enraged after we sent in a mail Jay to do a follow-up on his conference with you. Sophia's expression didn't change. I expected that, Mr. Rubin. Bonner isn't used to being denied. Max folded his arms across his chest. That's an understatement. Bonner had been born into wealth, gone to the most exclusive private schools, summered on a vineyard in Champagne, wintered at a ski resort in Switzerland. He'd had simply to ask and his parents had given it to him, their only son, a $100,000 car at 16, a trip around the world at 17, a private residence on their extensive property at 18. He'll try to play you, Bart said, tapping a pen on the old-fashioned legal pad he insisted on using. He's had a few days to do some underground research, maybe find out things about you. Sophia shook her head. I've survived worse monsters. Her eyes met Max's. It's time for me to go in. Every single muscle in his body went rock hard in rejection of the idea, but he nodded. I'll be right here, one small signal and I come get you. Sophia walked into the same room she'd entered only a few days prior, but this time she was viscerally aware of Max's gaze on her no matter that he stood hidden behind the wall that separated the room from the observation chamber. And though a prison guard stood with his back to the wall behind Bonner, it was the knowledge of Max watching over her that kept her calm, focused. Her cop would never let the monster touch her. With that knowledge in her heart, she said, Mr. Bonner, as she reached the table. Gerard Bonner's smile presumed an intimacy that made her skin crawl. Sophia, I'd rise to welcome you, but alas. He gestured to the clamps that kept him immobilized, his hands jerking to a halt. It's for my protection that you can't move, she said, taking a seat across from him. You have very strong hands. After torturing Carissa White in a multitude of horrific ways, he'd finally killed her with the intimacy of his hands. Are you attempting to shock me? A warm chuckle from the outwardly handsome man in front of her. I enjoyed it, you know. Poor Carissa. She begged me to do it in the end. So clever, she thought, always couching his words in a way that it was never quite a confession. Not that they needed it, not for Carissa White. I was told you were ready to cooperate. Did I put you to too much inconvenience with my request? He asked, his expression filling with what many would have mistaken for the sincerest of apologies. I find that I like you the best. You're so much gentler than the other JS. Did you know, Mr. Bonner, she said conversationally, that in the early part of this century, they still incarcerated males together in the same cell? Tell me. She held his gaze, let him see that she'd looked into the abyss, that nothing he said could touch her. Do you think you would have enjoyed a deliberate echo of his word, his tone? Being in a cell with another inmate who might not have shared your more sophisticated tastes. Bonner didn't like that. His eyes showing the sadistic bite of malignant rage before he got it under control. I'm sure I would have survived, Sophia. Does anyone call you Sophie? She hated that he'd used Max's pet name for her, hated it so much that for an instant, she wondered if she'd betrayed herself, because Bonner's blue eyes glinted with pleasure. You may call me anything you wish. A facsimile of calm, good enough that it had fooled the medics all these years. All I care about are your memories. Another crack in the facade. The ugliness inside him rising to the surface for a fleeting instant. Then take them, Sophie. Vicious words laced with charm. Take what you came to find. Then maybe you can tell me how you got such a pretty face. She did nothing, felt nothing. His words didn't matter. Not when Max saw her, knew her, accepted her. I'm not going on some kind of a scavenger hunt in your brain, Mr. Bonner. If you want to cooperate, then cooperate. If not, I'll make a final recommendation that your offers to share information have been nothing but a waste of time, and that all further approaches from you be ignored. Bitch. It was said in that same charming voice, his smile never slipping. Is the rest of your skin marked? Or are you a blank canvas just waiting for the right artist? One last time, Mr. Bonner. Are you ready to cooperate? Of course. She held the eye contact, sweeping out with her unique telepathic gift. Some JS needed physical contact with those they scanned, but she never had. And now with her sensitivity, touch would take her too deep, lock her into another's mind. And if there was one consciousness she did not want to be trapped within, it was that of the sociopath on the other side of the table. Moving effortlessly through the easily permeable barrier that was the weakness of a human shield, she stepped into his mind. It was as calm as orderly. But the pieces had shifted. Bonner was rearranging his memories of the past, perhaps to better fit his own personal view of the world. A woman's screaming face, her back contorted in agony, her eyes bleeding at the corners. Sophia recoiled inside, but years of training kept her from betraying her abhorrence on her face. We already know what you did to Carissa White, she said. If that's all you've got. A small wooden glade, peaceful almost. She felt the handle of the shovel vibrate under her hands as he slashed. They drove it into the earth, heard the eerie quiet, felt the cool crackle of the plastic under his slash. Their hands as he slashed. They rolled the body into the shallowest of graves. Bonner didn't waste any time covering his victim up again. His slash, their actions as impersonal as if he slashed they were raising a garden. The body had ceased to have any meaning once it stopped screaming. Not long afterward, the earth covered the plastic, and then they were walking through the forest, exiting less than 5 minutes later onto a rugged track swathed in fog. Firs, deep green, thick with foliage, their tips disappearing into the fine white mist, surrounded them on all sides, but there was a lot of undergrowth, a few spindly trees of other species. So not a tree farm but something more natural. She got into the vehicle, started the engine after stripping off heavy gardening gloves. The four-wheel drive took the rickety road with ease, until half an hour later, she appeared out of the fog and found herself at a T-junction, a sealed road in front of her. Her heart was calm, her body relaxed. It was. Sophia realized she was losing herself in Bonner, fought to bring herself back. I need a location. She could see nothing but the infrequent car zipping by fast, a lonely highway. Patience, my sweet Sophia. Bonner was breathing hard, excited by the memory. By making her relive it with him. That was when she saw it. The board on the left that marked the entrance to Fog Valley Track. She took note of the kinds of flowers she'd seen, the angle of the sun, the weather, everything she could. Then Bonner's memories shifted sideways, a twisting kaleidoscope. She'd expected something of the kind, pulled back before it could affect her. That doesn't give us much. You'll find her. He drew a long deep breath. You'll find my lovely Gwyn. Gwyneth Haley had disappeared 6 months after Carissa White, and was widely considered to be Bonner's second victim. Sophia tried to pry further details out of the butcher, but he just smiled that intimate, satisfied little smile and told her she'd have to do some of the work herself. Exiting, she let the medic scan her. You need nutrients, was the response. She drank the energy drinks he gave her, then let Bartholomew Rubin lead them up out of the bowels of the building, and to a conference room on the upper floor. If everyone could drop their shields, Sophia said. I can project the scan into your minds. This was part of what made her a J, rather than a simple telepath, the ability to literally project entire memories. She could only do 5 people at a time, but other than Max, there was only Rubin, the warden, and Rubin's assistant. I'm sorry, Detective Shannon. I can't project through your natural shield. Max shrugged. Projecting is tough on a J, right? He continued without waiting for an answer. Why don't you give us a recap instead? His eyes were piercing. If Bonner really is in a cooperative mood, we don't know how soon you might have to scan him again. He was protecting her. The knowledge made her heart expand until it threatened to consume her. Taking a deep breath, holding that powerful emotion like the treasure it was, Sophia described what she'd seen. Fog Valley Track, Max said. Already on the phone to the computer techs at enforcement. Yeah, how many hits? A pause. Narrow it down to a location with a lot of firs, relatively isolated, or it would have been 5 years ago, maybe off a highway. Sophia raised her hand to catch his attention. The temperature was cool, though the position of the sun suggested it was close to midday. Her mind filtered out the distractions of the other cars, Bonner's thoughts, and saw through to the other side of the road. There was a billboard advertising a harvest festival as he turned out of the track. Max repeated her words to the computer tech, waited a few moments. I owe you a drink. Send everything through to D2 Comstation 3. And encrypt it, just in case someone's scanning the prison line. Hanging up, he said. We've got 3 mentions of a Fog Valley track that might match, he said. The track was very rough, Sophia pointed out. Could be it's not on the maps at all. Yeah. A grim look. But we'll worry about that after we check out these images. Those images were transmitted moments later. Sophia said. That one. Almost before she was aware of opening her mouth. Gwyneth Haley's last resting place lay deep within a snow-capped mountain range. Chapter 27. Faith Nightstar, daughter of Counselor Anthony Kariakis and the most powerful foreseer in the world, walked out into the forest that surrounded the home she shared with her changeling mate, hoping the fresh air would melt away the fog that clouded her mind. Deep and viscous, damp and clammy, it felt almost real, the chill of it making her rub her hands up and down her arms. Something bad is coming, she said out loud, trying to think past the thick gray soup that hid everything from view. Fire and fog and screams and metal. They were all connected. The fog touched those in the center, but so did the flames and the stabbing, cutting violence of metal. She began to pace restlessly across the pine needles that littered the forest floor. Her gut twisted up with the knowledge that someone was going to die. Tears pricked her eyes, burned in her throat. Fire and fog and screams and metal. But no matter how many times she repeated that, no matter how many times she tried to part the fog, all she got was a crushing sense of impending horror. Chapter 28. Evil does exist. It may not be listed in any official manual, may be considered an emotional construct, but as JS, you must accept that there will come a time when you will be faced by such malevolence that it will challenge all that you know, all that you believe you are. Sophia Russo J. To trainee JS unofficial seminar held at an undisclosed site. 4 hours after Sophia pinpointed the location, the entire team, complete with the forensic unit, got out of their vehicles at the forested end of Fog Valley Track. Though the ground was currently clear, the air up here carried a touch of ice, the threat of snow lingering in the air. You, me and Bart, Max said to Sophia. We go in, see if we can eyeball anything. If that fails, we send in the dogs. It was just nudging 5, but the winter sunlight was fading fast. It would have been more sensible to wait until the next day, but an unspoken thought united them all. They couldn't bear to leave Gwen alone and cold in the dark any longer. Nodding, Sophia took the lead. The undergrowth has gotten considerably thicker in the years since Bonner was here. At least the path's still negotiable, Bart said, pushing a branch out of his way as he and Max followed Sophia's shorter form. It'll be a bitch to process though once we find the grave. Max shot out a hand to grip Sophia's upper arm when she stumbled over a rock. Thank you, detective. A calm, even voice, but Max had felt the slight tremor in her muscles. Knew his Sophie was hanging on through sheer stubborn grit. Anything look familiar? Dropping her arm, Max backed off, aware of Bart staring at him. Not so far. Bart nudged Max, his voice low. You know Psy don't like to be touched. They also probably don't like to fall flat on their faces. True. Blowing out a breath, Bart shook his head. I haven't called Gwen's parents yet. The name fell easily from the prosecutor's tongue. Like Max, he'd come to intimately know the short life and lost dreams of each and every girl. Neither have I, Max said, remembering Gwen's mile-wide smile, her long runner's legs, with an anger that hadn't dulled in the intervening years. No use ripping the scab off that wound unless we can give them some peace. Sophia went motionless up ahead, her head angled toward a twisted old tree on the edge of the path. I saw that. It was almost soundless. Max kept an eye on her as she stepped off the path and began to jog forward. Not more than 5 minutes into it, she jerked left and clambered onto a fallen log. But she didn't step off on the other side. Reaching her, Max jumped up on her right, as Bart did the same on her left. There was no need to ask her what she'd seen. It's like the land died here, Sophia said, her eyes on the lifeless patch of earth in front of them, which though bordered by the living beat of the forest, tiny shoots and greenery, was itself as brown and dry as dust. As if Gwyneth Haley's lifeblood had soaked into the soil and turned it barren. The forensic team worked deep into the night, under brilliant lamps. By midnight, they'd found only 7 discrete bones, the others in all probability having been carried away by forest creatures. But amazingly, one of those 7 was the skull. And there were teeth still attached to that skull. A positive dental match was made on the spot using mobile equipment. Sophia saw Max's shoulders shudder, and dropped the instant after the forensic technician made his pronouncement. I'll do it, he said to Bart Rubin. Bart's face was drawn, his eyes full of old pain as he acquiesced. They trust you more. Letting the prosecutor walk past her and back to the site, Sophia went to stand beside Max as he moved away from the group and into the night shadow of a giant tree with sweeping arms. You're calling her family? A nod, his face lined with angry sorrow. I'd prefer to do it in person, but I have to make sure they get the information before it leaks to the media. His fingers clenched on the phone. It'll tear them apart all over again. Hidden in the darkness, she dared lay her hand on his arm. But it will give them peace, and Gwyneth a safe place to rest. Max didn't reply, but he leaned into her touch. It threatened to shatter her. Because Max Shannon was not a man who leaned on anyone. As she stood there beside him, he coded in a number from memory and raised the phone to his ear. And then he did what had to be done. The next 2 days passed in a blur. Sophia had another conference with Bonner. However, he wasn't in the mood to cooperate. I'm enjoying my extra hour in the sun far too much, he told her. So obliging of the prison authorities to stick to their bargain with me. Knowing he'd string them along now that he had their attention, she didn't squander her time and instead asked Max if there was anything she could do to assist him. Keep an eye on the Nikita situation, he told her. Go over the forensic reports as they come in. Compare the results sent in by Nikita's people against those of the independent lab we contracted. As the lead detective on the Bonner case, he wasn't only dealing with the families of the victims, but also the brass and the media. His eyes bloodshot with lack of sleep. Did we receive the report from the mechanic on the crashed car? Yes. She confirmed the computer was tampered with. Sophia wanted to touch him, give comfort in the human way, but they were in the hastily thrown together war room, located in the closest enforcement station to where Gwyneth Haley's body had been found. Activity buzzed on every side, crashing against her senses. The second autopsy you ordered on the driver has also been completed. There were no drugs in Alison Marceau's system. Makes sense if the car was the weapon. He glanced quickly at the report. Even if she sent out a telepathic scream, it wouldn't have been noted as anything suspicious. It might be better if I went back. I can deal with things. Stay. It was a single quiet word, but it carried 1,000 unsaid things. Bound to him now by thread she didn't quite understand, but that had become the defining truths in her life. She stayed, setting herself up in her hotel room, away from the constant storm of the war room. To everyone's surprise, the council dispatched several PSI to help with the search around what had been dubbed Bonner Site Number 1. Psychometric since the imprints of the past, Sophia explained to Max when he asked for a quick précis. They usually work verifying the age and provenance of works of art, other expensive objects, but I've heard it said that some can also pick up echoes of events that took place in a particular location. I had a look at the title of the land, Max told her a few hours after the psychometrics arrived. It's owned by a Psy conglomerate and earmarked for development. That, Sophia thought, made much more sense. They don't want any unanswered questions lowering the value of the land and subsequent development. Not that it matters why they're here. Tanique, he named one of the PSI, already located 2 of Gwyneth's bones almost half a mile from the gravesite. That was one of the few conversations they managed to have in the bleak, exhausting hours that followed. It was on their last night at the search base, right after it was announced that no evidence of further bodies had been found within a mile-wide radius of the site, that she discovered something interesting. She'd been digging deep into the backgrounds of all the individuals of interest, tapping her connections in justice when necessary. The aristocratic Quentin Gareth came across as a ruthless businessman, but seemed otherwise clean. Andre Tulane, in contrast, had repeating weekly meetings that she could tie into nothing official, while the intern Ryan Asquith had a note on his file that meant he'd been reconditioned within the past year as a result of a court order. All merited further investigation, but the most interesting data resulted from a logarithm she'd been running on news uploads at around the time of the killings. Counselor Caleb Krychek had been in the relevant area at the time of every single murder. He'd even been snapped by the San Francisco Gazette, leaving an early morning meeting with Nikita, on the day Edward Chan had a knife thrust into his heart. It ties up so neatly, but at the same time it doesn't make sense, she said to Max the next day as she finished locking up her bag for the return trip to San Francisco. With the families of all the victims having been notified of what was happening behind the scenes with Bonner, and with no hope of finding any further remains, Max had decided they needed to turn their attention back to Nikita's situation. Isn't Krychek a telekinetic? Max asked, shadows under his eyes from the lack of sleep. Exactly, and he's teleport capable. It hurt her to see him hurting. She couldn't wait until they were home, where she could wrap her arms around him, give him the surcease he'd given her so many times. He would have been smart enough to teleport in to do the kills while he wasn't officially known to be in the region. Taking her bag and slinging his own duffel over his shoulder, Max headed to the elevators as she pulled the door to her hotel room closed. From what I know of Counselor Krychek, he said as she came to stand beside him, he's a stone-cold operator. I can't see him wasting time with the theater of a fake suicide. I've never heard a confirmation, but there are constant whispers that he was raised by a sociopath, that he's a murderer at heart. She'd seen Krychek once, on the other side of a hotel lobby, but his presence had made her alter her route, take the long way to her destination in order to avoid him. It had been self-preservation, the otherness in her recognizing an intelligence as lethal, and far, far colder. Max rubbed his hand over the jaw she'd watched him shave a few minutes ago when she'd gone into his room ostensibly to talk about the case. The experience had been starkly, beautifully intimate. The pattern's too political for a serial killer, he said, waiting until she stepped into the elevator before following. That kind of a sociopathic drive wouldn't have allowed him to keep his urges leashed to the extent of only committing murders on the verge of a big deal. There's another rumor that might be more apropos, Sophia said, curling her fingers into her palms to keep from touching the smooth skin of his jaw, breathing in the fresh pine of his aftershave. That Nikita and Krychek have some kind of an alliance. Now that fits the pattern, Max murmured as the doors opened at the garage level, heading to the vehicle they'd rented at the airport, a vehicle that had spent the entirety of the past 48 hours sitting in the garage, Max having had access to an enforcement car, while Sophia remained in the hotel to work. He dumped their bags in the trunk. Someone's trying to cause suspicion between the two. She was cut off by the beeping of her cell phone. Pulling it out, she said. Sophia Russo. Thank God I caught you. Max's phone won't go through. It was an unfamiliar voice, trembling as if the speaker had run 100 miles. This is Faith Nightstar. Getting into the car when Max opened the door for her, Sophia immediately realized the reason for the call. You had a vision. And the visions of a cardinal psi were accurate to within 1/100th of a decimal point. Yes, Faith said as Max snapped on his safety belt and went to put his thumbprint on the starter. The car is rigged. Do you understand? Frantic words. Don't start the engine. Max's thumb brushed the ignition switch. No. Sophia jerked Max's hand away from the ignition with a wrench that had his head snapping toward her. Sophia. Faith's voice merged with Max's demand to know what was going on. I'm fine, she said to Faith, tremors shaking her frame. We're both fine. Here, you better speak directly to Max. Leaning back in her seat, she tried to get her heart to beat in a normal rhythm as Max had a short, sharp discussion with Faith. Closing the phone, he ordered her to step out of the car. Neither of them said a word until they were standing in front of the innocuous-looking vehicle. I'm getting the bomb squad, Max said, using her cell phone to make the call when his own proved to have a flat battery. They'll be here in 5 minutes tops. So soon. She had to focus on the mundane, on the practical, rather than on the fact that Max had come terrifyingly close to death. Max touched her lightly on the back, and she realized just how much she'd missed the contact in the frenetic pace of the past 2 days. No one had ever told her that touch was something you became addicted to, the loss of it a hunger and ache deep within. They work out of the same enforcement building we used as a base. His hand dropped away as an enforcement vehicle drove into the garage. Still, that was damn fast. 2 men and 1 woman stepped out, all 3 in the protective gear of the bomb squad. Tell me what you know, the woman said. We got the heads up from an FSI, Max began. Foreseer. The woman whistled. I didn't realize they made civilian predictions. Heard it was all business. Faith Nightstar, Max said. She's part of Dark River. She saw the car explode after I started the engine. Given current technology, it's got to be some kind of a detonation message being sent to the actual device. She was already moving toward the car, equipment in hand. You two might want to clear the garage. You're not wearing protective gear. Max nodded to the entrance ramp. We'll be waiting outside. I'll give you a yell soon as we locate anything. Faith paced across the beautifully lighted cave that was her home office, rubbing her hands up and down her arms. You cold, sweetheart? Looking up, she found Vaughn in the doorway. Her Jaguar had a streak of white dust on his face, a rip near the bottom of his t-shirt, and was so wonderful she still couldn't believe he was hers. No, but she walked into his embrace. Hold me. Hey. His arms came around her strong and warm, one hand gripping a chisel he'd clearly been using on his current sculpture. I thought you said the cop and his J were all right? They are. She ran her fingers over the gritty dust that covered the skin of his arm. But I still have this knowing that something bad is coming. She hated the amorphous knowings even more than the dark visions. At least the vision showed her something concrete, something she could fight or avert. It's an emotional knowing, connected to someone who's important to me. Did you try the exercises you've been working on to fine-tune your control over your abilities? She nodded, sliding her hands under his t-shirt and to the muscled warmth of his back. I can't break through the veil. And Vaughn, it's something really, really bad. Ice filled her heart, coated her veins. What if I can't stop it? What if she lost one of the people she loved? Vaughn pressed his lips to her brow. We discussed this. You'll go mad if you take responsibility for every evil you can't stop. His tone was gentle but absolute. You saved 2 lives today. Celebrate that. Raising her head, she met those golden eyes. Eyes of a jungle cat made human, that had become the fulcrum of her universe. It's hard. And part of the reason why so many FSI had gone irrevocably mad in the past, that need to save every life, avert every sorrow, could devour the unwary. That's why you have me. Lips against her own, intense protectiveness in the way his body curved over hers. Let's see if we can't get you into a better frame of mind. And then her Jaguar was purring low in his throat as he peeled off her clothes. It'll come to you if you're relaxed. She felt her heart lighten with sensual humor. Oh, how she needed him. His ability to play, to laugh, to love, made every darkness bearable. So you're stripping me naked for my benefit? A look so innocent, it would have done one of Tammy's rambunctious twins proud. Of course. Faith let him love her, let him comfort her. and hoped it would break open the deadlock on her mind. Because whatever was coming, it was a crushing, terrifying blackness that only ever meant one thing. Death. Chapter 29. We don't choose our parents. And their mistakes aren't our own. You are what you make yourself. Don't ever forget that. Max Shannon in reply to an email from the soul survivor of the Castleton murder-suicide. Sophia allowed herself to lean against the garage wall once they'd exited onto the quiet street outside. She wasn't concerned about setting off alarm bells if caught on surveillance. Even Psy sometimes lost the perfect posture that had been drilled into them as a symptom and indication of control. Max braced himself with one arm on the wall beside her, his eyes ablaze though he kept his distance. His earlier touch everyone would discount as a human action inspired by the emotions of the moment. But if he touched her now, Sophia knew she wouldn't be able to resist crumbling into his embrace. You okay? Rough tone, violence contained. She wanted so much to crawl into his arms, to hold the solid reality of him to her until she believed he was alive, was safe. Yes. Lines bracketed Max's mouth. This has to be connected to the work we're doing for Nikita. Not necessarily. Realizing that he was focusing his anger into work, she kicked her sluggish brain into gear. Bonner is very wealthy, and Bartholomew said that he has many groupies. I'll have his visitor logs and mail records checked out. But fact is, he likes playing with you. I don't think he'd have you killed. He has no way of knowing I'm working with you on another case, she said, her hands clammy inside her gloves, her heartbeat erratic. Especially if this particular plan was put in motion before we met. He considers you his adversary, doesn't he? She'd seen the notes Bonner had sent to Max while he'd still been an unknown serial killer. Each had been a taunt, a declaration of his superiority. But then Max had caught him. Fuck. Blowing out a breath, Max clenched his fist against the wall, the rough texture of the plascrete rubbing against his skin. He wanted nothing more than to grab Sophia and drag her to his chest, to crush her close until the thudding fear of his heartbeat decreased to something less agonizing. Max! A soft word. A warning from a Jay with eyes full of remembered terror. Shoving his other hand into a pocket to stop himself from reaching for her, he said, Bonner likes to get up close and personal. Sophia nodded, her hair lifting in the breeze that sent a discarded soft drink bottle rolling down the otherwise empty street. Yes, a bomb is something more apt to be used by those of my race, especially if the aim was expediency. Let's see what the bomb squad has to say. They had to wait 15 more minutes before the squad called an all clear, having removed the device and placed it into a blast-proof container. High tech, the female member of the team said. Nothing your average malcontent could make on his own. Max hunkered down beside her, aware of the two males giving Sophia the once-over. If they so much as smiled wrong in her direction, those faces would be hitting the old-fashioned concrete of the garage floor. He was not in a rational mood right now. Someone wealthy? Sure. The rich can source anything, but they'd have to have some fairly strong contacts. This stuff is defense grade. Is it from a Psy company? Sophia came to stand so close beside him. He could have reached out and curved his hand around the smooth temptation of her calf. Though he forced himself not to touch, her proximity soothed the clawing edge of his protectiveness. Can't tell from a surface look, but they're the leaders in explosive technology, so I'm guessing yeah. She locked the box. You want me to call forensics? Thanks. Rising, he said goodbye to the bomb experts just as two uniformed officers arrived to hold the scene secure. Detective Chun is on her way, one of them said. Grabbing Chen's number from them, Max made a call to her, then one to Bart, telling him of the incident and asking him to have his people go over Bonner's mail and visitor records. I'll organize it, Bart said. Glad you're safe. Thanks. Ending the call, Max made another one asking for a ride to the airport. Shouldn't we stay for the investigation? Sophia asked. No point. Max wanted Sophia out of here, wanted her safe. I know Chun, and she's a hell of a detective. She'll keep us in the loop if they discover something. And she's okay with taking our statements over a comm link. And if this is connected to Nikita rather than Bonner, Sophia said, then we need to be in San Francisco. Yeah, because even Psy sure as hell wouldn't attempt to blow up a cop 5 minutes from an enforcement station unless they were planning something damn spectacular. Either we've gotten too close to something, or we were meant to be a distraction, Sophia completed. The question was, who or what target was important enough to chance taking out a cop? The fact that he was human didn't negate the danger. All politics aside, Enforcement Command would take the murder of one of its officers as a personal attack. Sasha grinned as Lucas stopped at a small corner shop to buy her an ice cream. Thank you, Mr. Hunter. You're welcome, Sasha darling. He shook his head as they pulled away from the store. I don't know where it all goes. She took a contented bite of her chocolate-coated chocolate ice cream. Don't make me mad. He shuddered. I think you've fulfilled your quota of crazy today. She made a face at him, able to hear the cat's humor in his voice. There is no quota, not once you start carrying around a bowling ball in your belly. A little pat to reassure the baby, who appeared to be fast asleep. Not that I don't adore our little bowling ball. A fond glance from the cat beside her. Why are we going into work? Because they need you to sign documents. Savoring the delicious treat, she sighed. It's such a beautiful day. Let's take a drive through the Presidio before we head in, he said, referring to the forested region just outside the city. You can find a nice sunny spot to eat your ice cream while I take a nap. She shot him a laughing glance, warmth filling her body at the remembrance of exactly why he was so sleep-deprived. Are you complaining? No. A wicked smile. I'm planning my revenge. Max and Sophia had gone over every piece of evidence related to Nikita's case twice by the time they were 20 minutes into their flight. What are we missing? Max muttered, frustrated at the feeling that they were being blind to something critically important. Bonner and his twisted games just didn't fit. The vanilla of Sophia's shampoo whispered across his senses as she bent her head over her organizer, an invisible caress. Whatever it is, it must be taking place soon if they came after us in such a high-risk location. They'd both realized the bomb could have been planted any time in the past 48 hours. Which meant, we have to work on the assumption that the timeline has to be very, very short by now. A strike anytime soon will break the pattern of murders before a big deal. Max had spoken to Nikita prior to boarding the airjet, reconfirmed that nothing was even close to final. Why? Some things made them push their schedule forward. Her thigh brushed his. The fleeting touch was a bomb centering him. Nikita's people. Anyone who'll be out of easy reach for a long period? Sophia tapped the screen of her organizer with quick motions. Prague, Berlin, Tokyo, hardly out of the way locations. And any who are going are coming back within a week or two at most. It has to be an issue of access, Max muttered. And for some reason, they were worried we'd figure it out. You, Max. Sophia's eyes turned an intense, incredible night violet. They were worried you would figure it out. You're the wild card in this situation. A human whose thought processes they can't predict. Okay, so a target a Psy wouldn't immediately think of, coupled with a deadly. Ice crawled through his veins right to his heart. No. Max. Where the hell did I see it? Reaching into the seat pocket in front of them, he pulled out the entertainment module. They were flashing the selections on the big screen when we boarded, remember? Yes, but what did you? There. He stopped on the front page of a national tabloid. The headline was, Scoop. Sasha Duncan pregnant. Below that was another headline in a slightly smaller font. Dark River Alpha keeps pregnant mate captive. Max put down the module. Bastards are afraid the cats really are about to put Sasha into hiding. A sick feeling bloomed in the pit of Sophia's stomach, as she remembered the glowing warmth of Sasha's presence. The Isai was something incredibly good, something their race needed to protect, not harm. Our cell phones won't work. As a result of accidents in the 20th century, all devices were now automatically blocked while an airjet was in the sky. Max was already rising. I'll talk to the steward. Get an emergency call out. Wait, Sophia said. That'll take too long. I'll do it on the Psynet. Though she was a very strong telepath, her shields were viciously degraded. If she attempted to send that far without the aid of the net, they could collapse, killing her before the message reached the intended recipient. You do it on the net, I'll make the call, cover our bases. Nodding, she closed her eyes to ensure total focus and opened her psychic eye. She hadn't tried to cross her new shields before today, but if they were hers, they should obey her. And they did, wrapping her in distinctive mobile firewalls as she exited out into the Psynet. Forcing herself to ignore the battering influx of information that was the endless river of the net, she arrowed straight to Nikita's mind. As expected, the counselor's shields were beyond impenetrable, but Sophia began to try to break them. It was the easiest way to ensure she'd get Nikita's attention as fast as possible. It only took a split second. Ms. Russo. Nikita's icy presence. People who attempt to hack my shields don't usually survive. Sophia knew full well she'd risked infection from a mental virus if the counselor had laced her defenses with her own personal brand of poison. You need to get a message to Sasha. We think she's the next target. Details. Nothing concrete, but it'll happen very soon. Nikita broke contact. Dropping out of the net, Sophia found that she was gripping the armrest so tight, her tendons showed white against her skin. Sophie, sweetheart, talk to me. It was a soft voice command, meant to carry to her ears alone as Max returned to slide into his seat. I told Nikita. She swallowed, realizing something too late. I just hope she was the right person to. Chapter 30. One thing I've learned after so many years on the job. No one is simple, no one is one-dimensional. And still people surprise me. From the private case notes of Detective Max Shannon. Sasha's and Lucas's phones both started beeping with the PAC's emergency code, when they were 2 streets over from the HQ. Then the car phone started beeping. What the hell? Lucas double-parked beside a bright magenta monstrosity that Sasha had been teasing him about buying. I'll get mine, Sasha was saying when she felt a telepathic knock on her mind. Firm, familiar. Mother. Her own telepathic reach was small, but Nikita's was so wide, she'd hear Sasha's weaker voice. You may have been chosen as a target by my enemies. I understand. The methods they've used thus far suggest they do not have a teleport-capable telekinetic at their disposal. I'll make sure I'm careful about my physical surroundings. Don't forget about explosives. No. I'll organize protection. Thank you, Mother, Sasha said, emotion a rock in her throat, but the PAC will take care of me. Promise. Very well. Nikita's mind dropped away, but Sasha didn't take it for disapproval. Glancing at Lucas, she saw his green eyes had gone cat. My mother just warned me I might be a target, she said. I thought you were pathing to someone. Starting up the car, he turned back the way they'd come, heading out of the city and toward their cabin. Faith had a vision. That was your phone. Dorian cornered a sniper on his security rounds. That was my phone. And Clay got a call from Max before his own informants told him about another suspicious man in the apartment building facing the HQ. That was the car phone. Sasha blew out a breath. Darling, you do realize that means the baby and I were never in any danger? Lucas squeezed the steering wheel as if he'd like to rip it off. I'm not going to calm down for a while, so deal with it. Reaching out, she rubbed the back of her hand over his cheek. Since we're going home, I'll have lots of privacy to pet you. A nudge in her stomach, a thump in her heart. And you can pet me back. The leopard shot her a quick glance. They would have hurt you too. How dare they? Lucas took her hand, brought it to her lips. The PAC would have never let that happen. The cunning way her leopard had turned her words back on her when it suited him thrust past the anger to leave only a deep need to touch, to love, to cherish. Take me home, Lucas. Max called Lucas the instant they landed. She's safe. We're both fine. You the reason Nikita knew? Sophie managed to pass on a message through the signet. Clay and Dorian have some intel out at our HQ that you should see. Probably shouldn't come over the comm lines. A long indrawn breath. And cop thanks. Hanging up, Max nodded to Sophie. She's fine. And we might have a lead. He waited only until they were inside the car before reaching over to close his hand over her thigh. His palm separated from her skin by nothing but the material of her skirt. He understood exactly how feral the Dark River Alpha was feeling at that moment. If Faith hadn't warned them about the bomb. I want to strip you to the skin and drive into you until we both scream. Max. It took him 3 minutes of teeth-gritting control before he could begin driving. Neither of them said another word until they walked into the Dark River building. Clay met them in the lobby and led them upstairs to a meeting room, where Dorian was waiting. The sentinel with his blue-eyed, blonde good looks raised a hand. Here's the lowdown. The assassin I found ate some kind of a fucking suicide tablet. I haven't seen anything like it outside of historical dramas. I worked a case where a small cult committed suicide en masse, Max said, his mind cascading with bleak images of small bodies curled up beside larger ones that should have protected, not harmed. They used a wine laced with poison. It speaks of fanatical devotion, his J said, rather than professionalism. But he was a professional too. Dorian showed them some images on the comm screen. His gear, the way he'd been waiting there long enough to have left DNA behind. If you know what I mean, the man knew what he was doing. Where's the body? Clay was the one who responded. Enforcement morgue. And the other one? Max asked. The sentinel looked disgusted. He figured out we were onto him and Rabbit. I had to bring him down in a public area. Enforcement was there within a minute. He's sitting in a cell not talking right now. No doubt he's Psy. There's something else. Dorian picked up what looked like a business card off the table. This was left behind in the room where the second sniper was hiding. That's evidence. Max scowled. You fucking contaminated the hell out of it. Trust me, Dorian said. You don't want that in the system. And we processed it. Max glanced down to see that the card carried a single line of text, what looked like a comm code. Turning it over, he read the handwritten note. Sasha HQ. I recognize that code, Sophia said in a quiet voice. It's Counselor Duncan's private line. Very well guarded, Dorian said. And available only to a select few. Max shook his head. Nikita isn't behind this. And the handwriting, the time's missing. Sophia took it from his hand. They were going to insert that once they'd hit Sasha, make it seem as if Nikita had given them the location and time. She placed the card back on the table. But the fact that they have this number further implicates someone in Nikita's inner circle. Another counselor would also have it, or be able to get it, Max said, eyes narrowed. No question that Nikita has a mole inside her organization, but there's a much larger power behind this. I've already got our informants on alert for anything that might be related, Clay said with a tightly held fury. You need us, we're there. Max tapped the card. What did you find? Dorian's scowl did nothing to lessen the sheer beauty of his face. Only usable print was surprise, surprise, Nikita's. They really thought you were going to fall for that? Max had seen the way the cats operated. They were highly intelligent predators. Dorian's mouth went grim. If they'd succeeded in hurting Sasha, we wouldn't have been thinking too straight. The leopard would have gone for blood. And Sophia realized with a chill in her heart, the ensuing carnage would have begun a war. Chapter 31. Nikita thought long and hard about her next move, considered too what it might betray. Nothing. She was careful. Picking up her cell phone, she input a code. Anthony Kariakis answered after a few seconds. Nikita, this is unexpected. Yes, Nikita thought it was. Though they occupied the same basic area of the state, their paths rarely collided. The Nightstar Empire was built around the foreseeing abilities so prevalent in their genetic line, while Nikita's own company had a much more prosaic base in housing and design. But we do have certain commonalities. A pause. Is this a council matter? No, that left them with only one common thread. A thread they'd never before discussed. Sasha was targeted by my enemies today. You may wish to ensure Faith's safety. I don't think you're doing this out of the goodness of your heart. Nikita had no heart. What she had were brains and a survival instinct that saw nothing wrong with killing, manipulation, and betrayal. But she wasn't fickle. That was bad for business. It strikes me, she said, that our aims have coincided more often than not in council matters of late. You're allied to Krychek. So are you. It was, she knew, less of an alliance than she had with Caleb, but it existed. They are attempting to take our territory, Anthony. That's their mistake. And for the first time, she heard the pure steel that had made Anthony Kariakis a threat long before he became counsel. Chapter 32. To my cop, I never imagined you could exist, that you would exist for someone like me. I never imagined that you'd look at me the way you do. I never imagined how hard it would be to say goodbye to Sophia Russo in an encrypted and time-coded letter to be sent to Max Shannon after her death. The main enforcement station in San Francisco was a sprawling complex full to the brim with humanity, and at present a psi assassin. Sophia took a deep breath as they were led down through the bullpen, and to the short-term holding facilities at the back of the station. So many voices, so many people, so many memories and dreams. It was a ceaseless buzz in her head, her shields already strained after the time spent in the enclosed space of the airjet. Though she kept her arms tight to her body, her face turned away, people still bumped into her. She'd managed to avoid skin-to-skin contact so far, mostly because Max had been using his own body to shield hers in the most subtle of ways, but it was impossible to do anything but grit her teeth against the onslaught of psychic noise. Hopes and wishes, hates and loves, joys and sorrows. Even though she couldn't read any specific thoughts, she could feel the colossal weight of those thoughts battering at her. The pressure against her shields was immense. She was terrified it would create a break, crushing her under an avalanche of other people's nightmares. Here you go. The cop who'd escorted them stopped in front of a cell. He hasn't said a word. Thanks. Max held out his hand. I appreciate the cooperation. The cop shook it, but his eyes were flat. You have psi backing. Call me when you're done. White lines bracketed Max's mouth as the other man walked away. She wanted to comfort him, but what could she say? She was psi, part of the very race whose history of arrogance meant Max was being seen as a traitor to his own people. His gaze met hers at that moment and something in him seemed to ease. Walking up to the old-fashioned steel bars of the temporary holding cell, he said, keeping your mouth shut isn't going to achieve anything, not while you're in Nikita's territory. The man sitting on a bunk on one side of the room didn't so much as turn his head. Max tried again, with the same result. Shifting to glance at her, Max raised an eyebrow. She took a step closer to the bars. Fanaticism, she said, keeping her tone clear, silent, pure, is a breach of silence. No response, but she knew he was listening. The fact that your colleague committed suicide when he was of sound mind and body speaks to that fanaticism. The man lifted his head. It could as well have been a tactical decision to deprive the enemy of an individual to interrogate. But you didn't follow that path, she pointed out. You didn't agree with his actions. I have nothing to hide. Cool words. It's no crime to be in an apartment in San Francisco, even one with a view of the Dark River building. Sophia wondered if the male had truly thought through the consequences of his actions. Legalese wouldn't save him, not when he'd proven himself part of the conspiracy against Nikita. Stepping back, she lowered her voice so that it would carry only to Max. Nikita doesn't know yet. That much was apparent because if she had, this man's mind would have been torn apart like so much paper before they'd ever had a chance to talk to him. Max set his jaw. I don't care who the fuck she is, she does that, I'm done with this case. They can blow her up for all I care. Nikita would bide her time, Sophia thought. Because right now she needed Max. Do you want to attempt further questioning while I... The scream was sharp, high-pitched. Even as the medical alarms began blaring, the Psy male fell forward and to the floor, his body flopping about in the throes of a seizure that had his head thumping over and over against the plascrete floor. Max had run to grab the guard with the key the instant after the first scream, but Sophia knelt by the bars, her heart twisting in pity. The would-be assassin's face was contorted, blood leaking out of his ears, and there in those final moments, Sophia saw fear fill his soul. Reaching through the bars, she gripped the hand that flailed toward her. Hold on, help is coming. His hand spasmed on hers, pulling down her glove, and he touched one finger to the skin bared at her wrist. A scream of sound, images and thought, yesterday's tangled up in dying agonies. Someone, Max wrenched back her hand. Sophia! She blinked, desperately trying to control the ugly roiling in her stomach. Help him! Came out husky rough. Max shook his head, his eyes solemn. It's too late. Following his gaze, she saw another enforcement officer inside with the prisoner, his head bowed in defeat. The Psy male's eyes stared unseeing at the ceiling. Nikita was adamant she hadn't killed the man. He was eliminated to prevent me from discovering what he knew, she said when they confronted her. If I had taken his mind, ripped away his secrets, I'd have no more use for you and Ms. Russo, detective, and I'd make sure you knew it. Sophia watched Max hold that chilling gaze. Now that I believe. This wouldn't have happened if I'd been notified at the start. It was true, because she'd have done the job herself. But she hadn't. And right then, Sophia was too numb to consider anything further. She felt battered and bruised by the time they arrived back home. She didn't make the slightest protest when Max ushered her into his apartment rather than her own. Go take a hot shower, he ordered, nudging her toward the bedroom and the bathroom that flowed off it. I'll make you something to eat. She felt her lower lip tremble, and it was such a strange sensation that she stared at him, uncomprehending. Come on, sweetheart. Soft words, a gentle tone as he walked her into the bedroom and turned her in the direction of the bathroom door with his hands on her shoulders, careful to keep his fingers away from her skin. He was taking care of her, she thought, her shocked state leaving her without defenses of any kind. You're the first person who's ever taken care of me. Even before her parents had rejected her, she'd been nothing but a practical responsibility. Max went very, very still behind her. Then, releasing a long breath, he leaned in close enough that their breaths mingled. Yeah. A slow smile. I guess that makes me a lucky man. Moving to face her, he tugged at her arms until she lowered them from around her waist. Then he pulled off her jacket. Baby, if I strip you, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to keep on being noble. Something snapped awake inside of her, electrified at the idea of Max seeing her naked. I'll be all right. Shifting back, Max took out something from the closet. You can put this on after. It was, she saw, one of his shirts. She could have as easily asked him to go into her apartment and retrieve some of her own clothing, but she took the shirt, took the scent of Max into her hands. Thank you. There's a spare towel on the rail. Leave the door open, he said. I'll be in the living room. I want to be sure I hear you if you call out. She couldn't find the words she wanted to say, so she forced her feet forward and into the bathroom. Leaving the door ajar, she listened to the sounds of Max moving about in the bedroom as he changed. By the time she peeled off her clothing and stepped into the shower, she no longer felt so close to breaking. Still, there was a new fragility inside of her, a new fracture in her innermost psychic shields. I can't break, she thought to herself, obdurate in her anger, her need, not yet. I haven't lived yet. Turning off the shower only after her skin was pink from the heat, she got out and used the spare towel to dry herself, then picked up Max's shirt and brought it up to her nose. It had been laundered, but she could sense echoes of Max's innate scent beneath the freshness of the detergent. It slipped easily over her body, hanging to mid-thigh. The color was white, but the fabric was thick enough that she didn't have to worry about her lack of underwear being embarrassingly obvious. Not that Max wouldn't already be aware that she was naked beneath his shirt. Feeling her cheeks color, she put her dirty clothes and gloves in a neat pile to the side, then stepped out into the bedroom. It was empty. Glad for the reprieve, she found herself walking to the dresser. A plain black comb lay on the surface, along with a wallet and a keycard. The austere nature of it suited him, she thought, because for all his masculine beauty, Max was a cop through and through. Taking the comb, she lifted it up to her hair. It felt wonderfully intimate to run it through the damp strands, and she imagined what it would be like to have him stroke her scalp with those strong fingers of his instead. Sophie. Startled, she dropped the comb on the dresser, turning to find him leaning against the doorjamb. He changed into faded blue jeans and a plain black t-shirt that caressed his lithe frame with soft ease. "You look so young," she said. With his hair sliding over his forehead and his expression outwardly relaxed, he could have been a college kid, but there was too much knowledge in those up-tilted eyes. "Look who's talking." With that, he pushed away from the doorjamb and closed the distance between them with that inherently masculine grace. "You look good in my shirt." She tugged at the cuff she'd rolled up to her wrists, nervous in a way she couldn't explain. "Max, the word stuck in her throat, hard-jagged. Eyes of near black met hers as he bent his knees to bring himself down to her height. "What do you need?" The dam burst. "Will you hold me, Max?" Max stepped closer. "Always. But are you sure? You're shy. Please." His arms came around her gently, so gently, as if he was afraid she'd shatter. But when she locked her own around his waist in an iron-tight embrace, his hold turned unbreakable. The electricity of their contact arced through her, but beneath it all was a tranquil, pure silence. A sigh rippled out of her, as she found sweet relief from the unremitting pressure of the millions of minds in the vicinity, the billions of thoughts pressing down on her. When Max shifted his embrace to cup the back of her head, she shuddered. He froze. "Sophie. All I feel is you," she whispered against his body, the warmth of him making her want to rub her face against him, rub her skin against him until he was a part of her. "Just you." "More?" A husky question. "More." Bending his head, he touched his lips to her temple, one of his arms moving up to curve around her shoulders, his fingers tangling in her hair. She expected him to speak, but what he did instead was drop a line of kisses along her cheekbone and down over her jaw. Shivering from the sensation, from the near painful pleasure of the contact, she stood on tiptoe, trying to get closer. A raw male chuckle. And then Max kissed her. This was no brush, no teasing taste. He took her mouth with the contained intensity she could feel thrumming beneath her fingers, his muscles taut, his entire body held barely in check. And she realized he was savagely angry, a tiger no longer on the leash. His tongue swept against hers, buckling her knees. She gripped his shoulders, tried to hang on, drowning in the dark masculine taste of him. Her heart was a rapid beat within her ribcage, her mind a place of splintering chaos. The only anchor, the only reality was Max. His shoulder muscles shifting beneath her grasp, he moved one arm down to clamp over her lower back, his hand scrunching up the material of the shirt. Air brushed the backs of her thighs, and she remembered she was standing in front of a mirror. But the thought was gone in the next instant as he tugged at her hair to angle her head for a deeper, hotly sexual kiss. Wet and open and demanding, it was the most intimate contact of her life. Her chest grew tight, so tight. "Breathe." A harsh order as Max broke the kiss. Sucking in a gasping breath, she pressed her mouth back to his. Kissing was wild and exhilarating and so shockingly intimate, she wasn't sure she could handle what came afterward. But she would. "No," the protest was rasped out as he broke the kiss a second time and gripped her arms, holding her hands from him. A red flush rode his high cheekbones and his voice when he spoke trembled with the force of emotion. "You're not thinking straight. I can't be alone, Max." She tried to close the gap between them, but he was too strong. "I want you. You had one hell of a psychic shock today," he said, refusing to budge. "I'm not about to let you cause further damage by overloading your—" "Stop it," she snapped out in spite of the fact that her skin was all but crawling with need, and had the satisfaction of seeing his eyes narrow. "I'm not a child you have to protect. I know what I want." Max hissed out a breath. "Your shields." "I don't know what's happening with my shields," she said, blunt in her need. "But I know that right now I'm an enigma to those in the signet. This is my chance." If that shield fails tomorrow, if my mind is torn open, so be it. But don't you dare deny us this because you think you're protecting me. Don't you dare. Max's fingers flexed on her wrists, but he didn't pull her forward. What about me? He asked, anger a vibrating thread in his voice. She was taken aback by the question, by the glittering emotion in his eyes. Max, what the fuck do you think it'll do to me to love you? Then watch as your mind breaks. Veins stood out along his arms, as if he was having to hold himself in vicious check to keep from shaking her.